The truck came up the gravel drive slow, the way trucks do when the man behind the wheel is choosing his words before he's even parked. Walter Renner watched it from the porch, one hand resting on the rail his father had built 60 years before, and he already knew what kind of morning this was going to be. The man who stepped out wore a clean shirt tucked into pressed jeans, the kind of outfit that had never once touched a hay bale. He carried a leather folder under his arm like it was something fragile. "Mr. Renner," the man said, "I'm sure you got my letter." Walter had gotten the letter. It sat folded on the kitchen table where he'd left it 3 days earlier, unanswered, because some letters deserve to sit a while before a man decides what to do with them. This one carried a number on it, a number large enough to make most farmers in the county sell before finishing their coffee. It also carried a deadline, and the deadline was 6 days away. "I got it," Walter said. "Then you know why I'm here. Ridgeline wants the North 40, all of it. Cash offer, quick close, no complications. Man your age, no offense meant, this kind of money doesn't come around twice." Walter looked past him out toward the 40 acres in question. From the porch it looked like nothing worth arguing over. Cracked earth the color of ash, stubborn weeds clinging to the low spots. A stretch of ground that hadn't grown a paying crop in 11 years, and that most of the county had long since written off as dead. His own daughter had said as much at Thanksgiving. His neighbor Otto Kruger had said worse and said it louder and said it at the feed store where everyone could hear. "I'm not selling," Walter said. The man from Ridgeline blinked like he hadn't heard him right. "Mr. Renner, I don't think you understand what's sitting on that piece of ground. It's not producing. It hasn't produced in over a decade. My clients ran soil tests. Salt contents through the roof, organic matter's basically non-existent. That land is finished. We're offering to take a liability off your hands and put real money in your pocket while you're still around to enjoy it." "I know exactly what's sitting on that ground," Walter said, and something in the way he said it made the younger man go quiet for a second. "That's why I'm not selling it." What Walter didn't say, what he hadn't told a single living soul, not his daughter, not his neighbors, not the bank that had started sending its own letters, was that the North 40 wasn't dying. It was 3 years into becoming something none of them would recognize, and if his plan held for one more season, it was going to prove every last one of them wrong. But that story didn't start with a letter from a development company. It started 4 years earlier, in a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee, on the night Walter Renner nearly lost everything that mattered to him at once. A quick word before the story keeps going. If you find yourself drawn to stories about quiet stubbornness, second chances, and people who see something worth saving when everyone else has already given up, this is the kind of story we tell here. Hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're tuning in from tonight. Now back to Walter and the ground nobody believed in. Walter Renner was 71 years old when his wife Colleen had the stroke that put her in a hospital bed for 11 days. He was a man who had spent his whole life measuring things, rainfall in inches. Yield in bushels, debt in dollars and cents written neat in a ledger he kept in the same drawer his father had kept his. And for those 11 days, none of the numbers meant anything at all. He sat beside her bed most nights, holding a hand that used to snap green beans on the porch every August, and he made a kind of promise to himself that men only make when the ground under them has genuinely shifted. He didn't know yet what the promise would cost him. He only knew that when Colleen came home, thinner, favoring her left side. But home, he was going to stop farming the way his father had taught him, and start farming the way that might actually let him keep this land and this life, and this woman for as long as he had left. The trouble was that farming the way his father taught him wasn't working anymore, and hadn't been working for a while. The North 40 had been the family's best ground once, deep black topsoil that his grandfather used to say you could grow a crop on nothing but faith. But 3 decades of the same corn and soybean rotation, heavy fertilizer, and a 5-year stretch in the 90s when a previous tenant had leased it, and mined it for every bushel he could squeeze out without giving a thought to what came after, had left the soil hollowed out. By the time Walter got full control of it back, the numbers told a brutal story. Organic matter down to less than 1%, salt buildup from decades of synthetic inputs, a soil structure so compacted that water pooled on the surface after rain instead of soaking in. Corn wouldn't take, soybeans barely limped along. For 3 straight seasons, the North 40 had cost Walter more in seed and diesel than it returned at the elevator, and eventually he'd just let it sit, the way you let an old dog rest instead of asking it to run. That was the ground everyone in the county saw when they drove past on County Road 12. 40 acres of cracked, gray-brown dirt that looked less like farmland and more like a wound the land hadn't healed from. What they didn't know was that Walter had spent every night of Colleen's recovery reading. Not novels, not the newspaper. He'd found a stack of old agricultural bulletins in the University Extension Archive. Dense papers about something called regenerative soil restoration, deep-rooted cover cropping, biological inoculants, controlled livestock grazing to rebuild microbial life in exhausted ground. Most of it had been written by researchers decades ahead of what most working farmers in the county had ever been taught, tucked away in academic journals nobody at the co-op ever cracked open. One name kept surfacing in the footnotes, Dr. Miriam Osei, a soil scientist who'd spent 20 years studying salt-damaged farmland reclamation in places that had all but given up on ever farming again. Walter wrote to her university address on a whim one night at 2 a.m., not really expecting an answer. She wrote back 6 weeks later, not with false promises, with a warning. What you're describing is not fast and it is not cheap, and for the first 2 to 3 years it will look to anyone driving past like nothing at all is happening. Most farmers who try this abandon it in year 2, right before the results would have started to show. If you're not prepared for people to think you've lost your way with that ground, I'd think twice before starting. Walter read that letter 3 times. Then he folded it and put it in the same drawer as his ledger, and he made his decision. He wasn't going to sell the North 40, and he wasn't going to farm it the old way either. He was going to bring it back to life quietly on his own timeline, and he wasn't going to explain himself to anyone until the ground itself could do the explaining for him. The first spring after Colleen came home, Walter did something that made his neighbors slow their trucks on County Road 12 the same way that Ridgeline Man's truck would slow 4 years later, though for very different reasons. He didn't plant corn, he didn't plant soybeans, he planted what looked from the road like a field of weeds, a dense, deliberately chaotic mix of tillage, radish, clover, sudangrass, and a half-dozen other cover crop species that Walter had special ordered from a seed supplier 3 states away after 3 phone calls that made the man on the other end ask twice if he had the acreage right. He didn't harvest a single bushel off that ground that year. Not one. He grew it, let it get chest-high, and then terminated it and let it lie down into the soil like a blanket, right when the neighbors expected him to finally cut it for hay or turn it under and plant something that would actually pay the note. You're going to lose that ground to the bank sitting there growing weeds, Otto Kruger told him at the co-op that August. Not cruel exactly, but with the particular bluntness of a man who'd farmed the same 300 acres for 40 years and trusted almost nothing he hadn't seen work with his own eyes. Land's supposed to earn its keep, Walt. Every season it sits like that is a season you're not getting back. I know what a season costs, Otto, Walter said. I've been counting them since before you could reach the pedals on a tractor. He didn't say more than that, he never did. His daughter Renee, who'd moved to the city 15 years back and called every Sunday out of love, and habit, both brought it up more than once on those calls. Her voice careful the way it got when she was worried about him and trying not to sound like she was worried about him. Dad, the Kruger place is turning double what you're getting off the home farm this year. Are you doing okay out there? Financially, I mean. I'm doing what needs doing, Walter told her, which was true, and which told her nothing, which was also entirely intentional. What Walter didn't tell Renee, or Otto, or the bank loan officer named Carl Voss, who started calling with increasing frequency as the second season of no income off the North 40 rolled around, was that he was following Dr. Osei's protocol to the letter, documenting everything in a green spiral notebook he kept in the truck's glove box. Soil samples sent out twice a year to a lab 3 counties over. Photographs of soil structure, taken at the same 6 spots in the field every season, so he could compare a shovel of dirt from this April against a shovel of dirt from 2 Aprils before. The first 2 years, the photographs looked almost identical. Cracked, pale, lifeless dirt that crumbled to powder in his palm instead of holding together the way healthy soil should. Dr. Osei had warned him about this, the trough before the recovery, the stretch where a man's faith gets tested hardest because the ground gives him nothing back to hold on to. There was a night in the second winter when Walter sat at the kitchen table with the bank's 3rd letter of the season in front of him, and Colleen, moving slower than she used to but sharper than ever in her judgment, sat down across from him and put her hand over his. You've never once told me what you're actually doing out there, Walter Renner. 20 years married, now going on 40, and you've kept a secret from me longer than most men manage to keep one from anybody. I didn't want you carrying the weight of it if it doesn't work, Walter said. I've already got you carrying enough with your leg the way it is. Colleen fixed him with a look that had ended more arguments in their marriage than either of them could count. I carried a stroke and I came back from it. I think I can carry a field of weeds, Walter, if you'll just tell me why you're growing them. So he told her, all of it, Dr. Osei's letters, the salt tables, the microbial life he was trying to coax back into ground that had been chemically starved for 30 years, the 3 to 5 year timeline nobody in the county had the patience for anymore. Colleen listened the whole way through without interrupting, which for Colleen Renner was its own kind of miracle. When he finished, she was quiet a long moment. Then she said, well then, I suppose we'd better find a way to make the payments some other way while we wait on your dirt to wake up. That was the night they decided to lease out 60 acres of the home farm's better ground to a younger farmer down the road, trading rent income for the breathing room Walter needed to let the North 40 finish what it had started. It wasn't a solution Walter was proud of. It felt some mornings like admitting defeat on the ground he understood in order to gamble on ground he was still learning. But it kept the bank quiet, and it kept the spiral notebook filling up, season after season, with numbers that were beginning, barely, almost imperceptibly, to move. By the third spring, something in the field had changed in a way you couldn't see from the road, but could absolutely feel if you knelt down and put your hands in it. Walter remembered the exact morning he noticed it, a cool April day. Frost just burned off the grass when he drove the truck out to the North 40 to pull his usual soil sample from spot for the low corner near the old fence line that had always been the worst of the worst ground on the whole farm. He knelt down, pushed the trowel in, and felt something that made him stop and sit back on his heels. The soil held together. Not crumbled to dust between his fingers the way it had for 2 straight years, but held its shape, dark and slightly moist, threaded through with fine white filaments he recognized from Dr. Osai's photographs as mycorrhizal fungal networks, the underground infrastructure that healthy soil uses to move nutrients and water between plant roots, the thing that had been almost entirely absent from this ground when he'd started. He drove home faster than he had any real reason to and called Dr. Osai's university office, getting her voicemail, then getting her 40 minutes later on a return call. "Describe it to me exactly," she said, and he did, standing in his kitchen with dirt still under his fingernails, describing soil structure to a woman 3 states away like it was the most important conversation of his life. "That's your biology waking back up, Walter," she told him, and he could hear something like genuine excitement under her careful, measured tone. "That's exactly what year 3 is supposed to look like if the protocol's working. You're not out of the woods, but you're through the hardest part." He didn't tell Otto Kruger, he didn't tell the bank. He told Colleen that night over dinner, and she smiled the way she used to before the stroke, a full smile that reached all the way to her eyes, and she said, "Well, Walter, looks like your weeds finally decided to do something." That summer, for the first time in 5 years, Walter planted a modest cash crop into a strip of the North 40, not the whole field, just 12 acres, a controlled test the way Dr. Osa had recommended, seeding a drought-tolerant variety of grain sorghum into ground that had spent 3 seasons rebuilding itself in silence. The rest of the county assumed he was finally giving up on his experiment and going back to something that would earn a paycheck. Otto Kruger even told him as much at the co-op, not unkindly this time, more like a man relieved his neighbor had finally come to his senses. "Knew you'd come around eventually, Walt. Ground's ground, can't fool it forever with fancy notions." Walter just nodded and let him believe what he wanted to believe. He had learned, over 3 years of silence, that correcting people before he had proof to back it up only cost him energy he needed for the field. The drought that hit that July was the worst the county had seen in 11 years. Forecasters had missed it entirely, predicting a normal rainy pattern that simply never arrived. By the 3rd week without measurable rain, corn on the Kruger place and every other farm along County Road 12 had begun curling its leaves at midday, rolling tight to conserve what little moisture remained in soil that had spent decades losing its capacity to hold water in the first place. Walter watched his 12-acre sorghum test plot on the North 40 with the particular tight-chested worry of a man who has staked more than money on a single outcome. But something happened out there that hadn't happened anywhere else along that stretch of road. The sorghum held. Not perfectly, there was stress in the leaves by early August, a visible tightening that told him the plants were working hard. But it held in a way that the neighboring fields, planted in traditional rotation on compacted, organically depleted ground, simply couldn't manage. The soil Walter had spent 3 years rebuilding held water differently now. The organic matter he'd worked to restore acted like a sponge, storing moisture from the rare rains, and releasing it slowly instead of letting it run off the hardened surface or evaporate straight back into the August heat the way it had for years before. Carl Voss from the bank drove out himself that August, not with a foreclosure letter this time but with genuine curiosity, having heard secondhand through the grapevine that Walter's little test plot was somehow outperforming ground 3 times its size. "I'll be honest with you, Walter," Carl said, standing at the edge of the field with his hands in his pockets. "I've been sending you letters for 2 years wondering if you'd lost your mind out here. I did not expect to be standing in the one field in this county that's still green in the middle of a drought like this." "It's not magic, Carl," Walter said. "It's just dirt that can finally hold onto water the way dirt's supposed to." Word moved fast after that, the way it does in a small county where everyone's business eventually becomes everyone else's business, whether they want it to or not. By September, people had started slowing their trucks on County Road 12 again, not to shake their heads this time, but to actually really look at the strip of green sorghum standing tall against a landscape of stressed, browning corn all around it. Otto Kruger came by one evening in early September, letting himself through the gate the way he had for 30 years of borrowing tools and returning favors, and stood at the edge of Walter's test plot for a long, quiet moment before he spoke. "I owe you an apology, I think," Otto said finally. "Called your ground dead more than once, called it worse than that at the co-op probably when you weren't around to hear it." "You weren't wrong about what it looked like, Otto," Walter said. "I wasn't showing anybody what it actually was." "Well," Otto said, kicking at the dirt with the toe of his boot, "you want to tell me now," so Walter did. He walked Otto through the whole thing, standing right there at the fence line as the light went gold and long across the field. Dr. Osai's letters, the 3 years of cover cropping with no income, the soil samples, the mycorrhizal networks, the slow, patient work of convincing dead ground it still had a reason to come back to life. Otto listened without interrupting, the way men who have farmed the same ground their whole lives listen when something challenges everything they thought they knew about it. 3 years of nothing, Otto said when Walter finished. Bank breathing down your neck the whole time. And you never said a word to anybody. Didn't think anybody would believe me until the ground could do the talking, Walter said. Figured I'd let it. That brings the story back around to the beginning, to the truck coming slow up the gravel drive. To the man in the pressed jeans, with the Ridgeline offer folded in his leather case. Standing on Walter's porch 6 days before a deadline that would have handed 40 acres of the most promising ground on the whole Renner farm over to a development company that wanted to turn it into something that would never grow a living thing again. By the time that letter arrived, Walter was 4 years into the project, not 3. The full 40 acres had come back into rotation the season before, not just the 12-acre test strip, and the numbers coming back from the lab were numbers Dr. Ost herself had called, in an email that Walter kept printed out in his kitchen drawer, about as complete a soil recovery as I've seen documented on land this badly degraded, in a timeline this short. The Ridgeline company hadn't known any of that when they made their offer. Their soil tests, Walter would learn later, were nearly 2 years out of date, pulled from county assessment records instead of anything current, describing ground that no longer existed in the shape their file said it did. They'd seen a low assessed value on paper and a 75-year-old farmer with a struggling operation, and they'd assumed. The way Marlene's Diner crowd had assumed, the way Otto Kruger had assumed. The way half the county had assumed for 3 straight years, that they understood the whole story from the outside looking in. Mr. Renner, the Ridgeline man said again, shifting his weight on the porch steps, clearly unsettled by how calm Walter seemed for a man supposedly facing his last real chance at a payday. I want to be straightforward with you. This offer isn't going to be on the table indefinitely. If the ground really is as marginal as our data shows, I'd think hard about what happens if you turn this down and that ground keeps failing you for another 5-10 years. Walter finally stepped down off the porch and walked the man out toward the fence line. The same fence line where he'd stood with Otto a season earlier, until they could both see the North 40 stretched out in the early autumn light, full green structured in careful rotation strips that Dr. Osai had helped him design for long-term resilience, not the cracked gray wasteland the man's outdated file described. The Ridgeline representative stopped walking. He stood there a moment, looking out at land that did not match a single word of the report he'd been handed before making the trip out. This isn't the field in our file, he said slowly. No, Walter agreed. It isn't. It's the field I've spent 4 years turning it into. Your file's about 2 years and a whole lot of patience out of date. The man didn't have much to say after that. He left without the folder ever coming fully open, and Walter never heard from Ridgeline again. The full 40-acre harvest that fall told the rest of the story that Walter had spent 4 years keeping quiet. Yield numbers off the North 40 that year came in ahead of the county average for the first time in over a decade, on ground that 11 years earlier had been so exhausted, it couldn't turn a profit no matter what Walter planted in it. The custom harvest operator running the combine actually climbed down from the cab partway through to double-check the yield monitor readout, certain something had to be malfunctioning, before running the same pass twice more and getting the same answer both times. Word moved through the county fast, the way it always did, except this time nobody at Marlene's Diner was laughing about it. Hank down at the co-op ran the county assessment numbers himself out of pure curiosity and found that Walter's North 40 had gone in 4 years. From some of the lowest producing acreage in the entire township, to some of the most resilient ground anyone could point to, the only field along that whole stretch of County Road 12 that hadn't buckled under the July drought that had hurt nearly every other operation in the county that season. Renee drove out from the city the following weekend, something she hadn't done nearly often enough in the years since she'd moved away, and she walked the field with her father in the low autumn light. Running her hand along stalks of grain that had grown out of soil she'd genuinely believed for 3 long years was killing her father's finances and maybe his spirit right along with it. You never told me any of this, she said. 4 years, Dad. I was worried sick some Sundays, I thought as she stopped, not quite able to finish the sentence. I know what you thought, Walter said gently. I let you think it some of the time because I didn't have proof yet, and I didn't want you carrying my gamble on top of your own life in the city. Your mother carried it with me instead once she found out. That was enough hands on it for a while. Renee looked out over the field a long moment, the same gold evening light settling over rows that 4 years earlier had been nothing but cracked earth and stubborn weeds. Grandpa always used to say this was the best ground on the whole place, she said quietly, before it went bad. It didn't go bad on its own, Walter said. Somebody mined it hard for a few years, took everything out and put nothing back, and then it just needed somebody willing to sit with it a long while and put back what was taken. Dirt's more patient than people mostly. It'll forgive you if you give it time and stop asking it for more than it's got to give. By the following spring, 2 other farms along County Road 12 had started their own cover cropping trials on their worst ground. Borrowing pages straight out of Walter's spiral notebook after he finally, at Colleen's gentle insistence, agreed to host an informal walkthrough of the North 40 for anyone in the county curious enough to show up. Nearly 30 people came that Saturday morning, more than Walter expected and more, frankly, than he was entirely comfortable with, given how many years he'd spent keeping the whole project to himself. Otto Kruger showed up early and stood near the front the whole time, nodding along at things he'd have argued against without hesitation 4 years earlier. Karl Voss came from the bank, not in any official capacity, just curious, and stayed afterward to ask Walter detailed questions about financing structures for other farmers who might want to attempt something similar without risking everything the way Walter had. Dr. Osai drove out from 3 states away for that walkthrough, the first time she and Walter had ever met in person after 4 years of letters and phone calls. She knelt down at the edge of the field. The same low corner near the old fence line, where Walter had first felt the soil hold together in his hands that third spring, and she pulled a handful of dark structured earth from the ground and let it crumble slowly, deliberately back through her fingers. "You did more with this ground than most of the farmers I've worked with over 20 years, she told him, in front of the whole gathered crowd, though she said it quietly, the way a person says something meant for one listener even in a room full of them. "A lot of people read the same protocol I sent you. Most of them give up somewhere around year 2, right when it starts asking the most of them and giving back the least. You didn't just read it, Walter. You trusted it long enough to let it finish what it started." Walter didn't say much in response. He never had been a man for long speeches, even standing in the middle of a field that 4 years of quiet, doubted, unglamorous work had brought all the way back from the edge of being written off for good. He just nodded and looked out over ground that had once been the subject of every unkind joke told at Marlene's diner, and felt something settle in his chest that felt a great deal like the promise he'd made to himself in that hospital hallway, finally, fully kept. Colleen still teases him about it sometimes, over dinner, calling it his 4-year argument with a field of dirt. But there's no real doubt left in her voice when she says it anymore, just something warmer, the particular fondness that comes from watching someone you love prove themselves right the long, hard, unglamorous way, with nobody clapping for the first 3 years of it. The North 40 gets rotated differently again this coming season. Following the next stage of Dr. Osai's long-term plan, deeper cover crop diversity worked into the strips that produced grain last fall, resting other sections the way the whole field once rested for 3 years running. Nobody along County Road 12 slows their truck to shake their head at it anymore. If anything, they slow down these days to look for what Walter's doing next, the way you watch someone who's earned the benefit of the doubt the hard way and never spent it carelessly. Walter still keeps the green spiral notebook in the truck's glove box, filling in new soil samples every season, the numbers climbing slowly, steadily, the way real recovery climbs instead of the way people wish it would. Some evenings he walks the fence line alone, after Colleen's gone in for the night, and kneels down at that same low corner where the soil first told him, silently, that 4 years of doubted work had actually taken root. It was never really about the sunflowers of some other farmer's story, or the flowers, or any single crop at all, if you asked Walter what the whole thing had actually been about. It was about a man refusing to believe that exhausted, written-off ground was finished for good, simply because it looked that way to everyone driving past at 40 miles an hour with no reason to stop and kneel down and check for themselves. "People want proof before they'll believe in something," Walter told Renee once, the two of them walking the field together on one of her now much more frequent visits home. "But dirt doesn't care whether you believe in it or not while it's healing. It just needs you to keep showing up anyway, especially on the days it's got nothing to show you back yet." If this story reminded you that quiet, doubted patience often outlasts loud certainty, we'd love to have you subscribe and join this community of people who love stories like Walter's. Before you go, let us know in the comments, has anyone in your family ever stuck with something everyone else had already written off? Or simply tell us where you're watching from tonight. We'll see you in the next one.